All right. To everyone drawn to the eerie, the unsettling, and the downright unexplainable, you're in the right place. If you live for stories that send chills racing down your spine and linger in your thoughts long after the lights go out, then get comfortable because this one hits different. Before we dive in, I've got to ask, where are you tuning in from and what time is it on your end? The stories. What a delivery driver saw outside the last house on the route. The incident reportedly came from a route sheet pulled from an old regional dispatch office, and it referenced a final stop that never made sense. The archived note mentioned a driver who claimed someone waited outside the last house even after the street was cleared. Rylan Mercer was 32 and worked as a delivery driver for a regional shipping line that handled late evening drop-offs. He lived in a small rented place near a quiet highway spur and tried to keep his nights predictable. He clocked in around sunset and followed the route grid until everything on the manifest was scanned. He liked that rhythm and needed the extra hours after rising fuel prices drained his budget. The night that changed him came in early autumn of 2019 when a mild drizzle pushed across the county roads. His simple goal was to clear the last 4 stops before 9 so he could get home. The final house sat at the far edge of a sparsely built neighborhood where new construction had stalled after funding issues slowed development. Rylan reached the second-to-last stop without trouble and scanned the small parcel while a porch light flickered behind the occupant. He waved, returned to his truck, and checked the tablet. The final address displayed a short note that read, "Gate partially damaged. Approach with caution." He thought it sounded dramatic, but he kept moving because delays meant more paperwork. The dirt road to the final house felt different because the gravel ruts were deeper than they looked on satellite maps. His tires shook through the uneven track, and he slowed so the cargo would not shift. He remembered the drizzle turning into a steady fall that made the old fence lines appear faded. His truck headlights cut across the trees while the route timer beeped. The house came into view as a single-story structure with siding worn by years of heat. An old pickup sat beside the carport with its door cracked open like someone left in a hurry. Rylan stepped out, grabbed the padded envelope, and noticed a figure standing near the tree line. The person faced the house and barely moved. Rylan called out because it seemed natural. The figure did not answer. He felt uneasy, but walked toward the porch because the package needed a signature. He knocked on the weathered door and waited until a woman in her 40s answered with tired eyes that hinted at several sleepless nights. Her name was listed as Marrakesh, and she signed without looking away from the tree line. She whispered that someone had been standing there for 3 nights. Rylan glanced back toward the trees and saw the figure slowly turn, as if reacting to the porch light. He asked Mara if she knew who it was. She said no and explained that local deputies had driven by earlier but found no footprints. She added that her dog refused to go outside after dusk. Rylan tried to reassure her, but he felt tense when the figure stepped closer. He returned to his truck and logged the delivery while watching the silhouette move with an unusual stiffness. He noted that the figure wore a long coat that flapped in the wind, yet the shape underneath did not shift. He heard a soft tapping on his side mirror and thought it was a branch until he noticed no branches reached that far. He started the engine and pulled slightly forward. Mara called out from the porch, asking him not to leave yet because she feared the figure might approach her door again. Rylan kept the truck idling and stepped out with his phone raised. The figure paused near the edge of the driveway and tilted its head as if listening. Rylan recorded a short, shaky video for possible evidence and captured the moment the figure retreated into the dark corner of the lot. He urged Mara to call the non-emergency line again. She did and mentioned his presence in the background. Dispatch reportedly confirmed previous calls from that address during the same week. Rylan waited until she hung up, then walked toward the driveway entrance to check for tracks. The drizzle had softened the soil, but he noticed 2 long impressions in the mud that did not match any standard boot pattern. He crouched to inspect the impressions and realized they looked stretched, as if the heel marks dragged unnaturally. He took photos to document it because the deputies would need something clear in case the rain erased the evidence. When he stood, he saw movement near the abandoned construction lot behind the house and raised his phone again. The figure reappeared near an unfinished foundation block. Rylan shouted, asking what they wanted, and the figure responded with a faint rattling sound that could have been fabric or gear. It stepped behind the block and vanished from sight. Rylan reached the spot within seconds, but found nothing except a plastic tape marker used by survey crews. He picked it up and noticed someone had written a date that predated the stalled project by 2 years. Mara approached carefully and said previous owners told her strange things about that construction lot. She reported hearing scraping sounds at night and seeing floodlights flicker without power issues. Ryland suggested checking the old project files because developers usually left public records. Mara said she tried, but half the records were archived manually before digital conversion. Rylan offered to look at the files later because he had experience sorting scanned documents from a part-time job years earlier. She thanked him and pointed to the tree line again. The figure stood there once more, closer than before, and seemed to watch them without any visible breathing motion. Rylan backed away and urged Mara to go inside. He waited in his truck until deputies arrived. They swept the area with flashlights and found nothing except the strange impressions in the mud. One deputy mentioned similar calls from another street where witnesses described a silent watcher near multiple houses. He said the figure always retreated beyond the last visible yard before vanishing in the dark. Rylan drove home late and reviewed his video. He noticed a faint reflection on the figure's coat that resembled a badge clip or small tool. He zoomed in and saw a blurred shape that matched old utility company tags from the early 2000 era. Employees sometimes wore heavy coats during winter maintenance, and older coats used reflective threading around the collar. The next day, he visited a small records desk at the county office. He asked about utility work in the stalled development. A clerk pulled a faded binder that listed crew rotations from 2001 to 2003. One name had several warnings about night shifts, where the worker logged extended hours without partner verification. A final note mentioned an unresolved disappearance during a routine inspection after a severe storm. Rylan compared the coat description from the old files to the figure in his video. The match seemed close, but not perfect. He requested access to old lot surveys and found a handwritten report describing a flagged hazard trench near the exact foundation block where the figure vanished. The report stated the trench was filled without proper inspection because storms destroyed monitoring equipment. He returned to Mara later that week and showed her the findings. She said deputies had returned twice and installed a temporary sensor light. She had not seen the figure since the previous night, but her dog still refused to approach the tree line. Rylan and Mara walked to the construction lot and checked the ground. The soil had settled unevenly, suggesting a collapse zone beneath the surface. Rylan believed the figure might be a residual impression or a person reenacting old patterns from a job that ended abruptly. He shared the theory with Mara, and she nodded, relieved to hear something grounded rather than supernatural. They both agreed the coat and the strange movements could indicate someone reenacting a memory or suffering confusion while hiding from help. The county eventually fenced the lot after a safety inspector confirmed unstable ground. Rylan moved to a different route by winter and rarely saw the neighborhood again. He kept the video and photos in a private folder and updated dispatch about the gate note so new drivers would avoid the unstable area. He thought about the figure sometimes when rain hit the windshield during his late runs. The memory stayed sharp because the silence in that yard felt heavier than the weather. He never claimed to know the full truth, but he trusted the possibility of a confused worker returning to a familiar site. He understood that some routes go beyond simple deliveries. He believed the last house had carried a story that lingered longer than any scanned package. The stories. Why the police sealed off this roadside chapel. The small roadside chapel sat near a quiet county highway where drivers sometimes stopped during long rural trips. Local deputies reportedly closed it in late 2019 after a traveler found something that changed the tone around the place. The building was simple, and people usually barely noticed it. The story centered on a 34-year-old maintenance surveyor named Corbin Hale, who often drove that route for work. He lived in a nearby town, and he usually kept to a steady schedule that involved checking rural drainage markers along the highway. On a mild afternoon in late September of that year, he planned to finish early so he could meet a friend for dinner. He stopped near the chapel because one of the markers behind it looked slanted, and he wanted to document it. He walked toward the spot while carrying a small camera and a work notebook. The chapel door stood slightly open, and he remembered hearing nothing except distant traffic. He planned to ignore the building until he heard a short tapping sound from inside. The sound made him pause, and he stepped closer to check if someone needed help. He called out a quick greeting but got no answer, which felt strange considering the soft tapping kept going. He pushed the door with his boot and saw dust drifting through a bright slant of late daylight. A wooden bench near the front looked recently moved because its legs scraped fresh lines across the floor. The tapping came from deeper inside the room, which held only simple furniture and a small cross fixed above a shelf. Corbin noticed a backpack sitting beside the far wall, which did not belong to anyone he had seen earlier. He stepped in and recorded a short clip on his camera to document the scene. The tapping stopped once he moved toward the backpack. He felt uneasy, which he later described in a written statement to deputies. He returned outside and found a driver who had pulled over to check a map. That driver, named Rhea Dunford, told police she had been there roughly 10 minutes and saw no one enter or exit the chapel. She agreed to wait while Corbin called the non-emergency line to report an unattended bag because he worried about possible travelers who might need help. Deputies arrived 20 minutes later, according to their logs, and inspected the chapel with measured caution. Inside the bag, they found a wallet and an old flip phone plus a folded printed photo of the chapel. The photo looked like it had been taken years earlier because the paint on the door in that image was a different shade. The wallet held no cards, and the phone battery was nearly dead, but it powered on long enough for one deputy to see 3 saved video clips. Those clips showed brief shots of the chapel interior taken during different seasons, which suggested someone had visited repeatedly. In each clip, a bench had been moved to a different spot, and in the final clip, a faint figure appeared reflected in the small window which faced the highway. Deputies later said the figure looked like a person crouched near the bench, though the image lacked clarity. Investigators reviewed old repair records for the chapel, which belonged to a small regional trust that handled forgotten roadside structures built decades earlier. The trust produced a file showing a volunteer caretaker named Myron Keats, who went missing in early 2009 during a routine supply run. His last note mentioned stopping at the chapel to drop off paint. No clear link existed between his disappearance and the backpack, except the printed photo which matched the photography style in a few older trust documents. Investigators searched local archives for any reported visits after his disappearance and found a single entry in 2015 from a driver who claimed to see a man moving a bench inside at dusk. That report named no suspect, and the driver never returned follow-up calls. Deputies used the phone clips to frame their timeline and interviewed residents who passed through the area before the chapel closure. One witness, named Avery Lorne, recalled seeing a tired-looking man near the highway in early 2017 carrying what seemed like paint supplies. She described him as quiet and focused on the chapel path. Her statement matched the trust note, which strengthened the idea that someone remained connected to the building for years. Investigators also compared the fresh scrape marks on the floor with older photos taken by trust volunteers. Those older photos showed the bench in fixed positions, which suggested someone had moved it repeatedly in recent months. This supported the idea that the visitor returned long after Myron disappeared. When they completed their review, they sealed the chapel for safety because they believed an unknown person had been sheltering there. The person possibly struggled with memory issues or untreated fear of being found, according to one unofficial summary shared with Corbin. They suspected the tapping sound came from the bench shifting under slight pressure, which fit with his description. The unknown visitor was never located, and no missing person report perfectly matched the wallet photo, though the style resembled a younger Myron. Authorities kept the case open, but treated it as a possible long-term wandering situation rather than foul play. Corbin later told friends that the chapel felt different when he drove past on later surveys. He thought about the way small, forgotten places can hold tangled stories that no one fully understands. He believed the closure made sense because it protected whoever might return, as well as anyone who stopped without knowing the hidden history. He still remembered the tapping sound and considered it a reminder that quiet places often carry quiet warnings. The stories. This park bench became the key to 5 disappearances. In many archived reports tied to a quiet suburban trail, one park bench kept showing up in every witness statement. The bench sat beside an older walking path that locals used for years, and it became the center of a strange pattern tied to 5 missing people. The story followed a 34-year-old technician named Braden Lyle, who lived a few miles from the park. He worked maintenance shifts at a small distribution center, and he often stopped by the trail after long nights on the floor. He used the spot to unwind and clear his head before heading home. His goal that morning in early autumn of 2021 was simple. He planned to sit for a few minutes and send a short message to his sister who had been asking about a ride the following weekend. Braden parked near the first turnoff, and he walked toward the bench while thinking about breakfast. The path was empty that morning, and the air felt colder than it usually did. He reached the bench, and he set his bag down while noticing fresh flowers near the base. He had seen flowers there before, but usually only one or two. That morning, he counted 3 bunches, and each looked recently placed. He sat and opened his phone, and that was when he heard a faint snap behind him. He turned, but saw no one on the path. He listened for a moment, and he heard what sounded like quiet breathing near the small cluster of trees. He stood and called out a simple greeting, and he waited without moving. The breathing faded, and he felt uneasy enough to step back from the bench. A woman approached from the trail side and asked if he had heard something by the trees. Her name was Maren Ulrich, a 31-year-old caseworker who visited the trail on her days off. She pointed toward the bench and said she had seen a man sitting there 2 days earlier who vanished after dropping a small notebook. Braden asked what she meant by vanished. She explained that the man had walked toward the trees, and no one saw him leave the area based on her follow-up checks. Braden felt a chill and picked up his bag, and he asked if she had looked around for the notebook. She nodded and said she had found it under the bench. She kept it at home after failing to find a name inside. She told him she could bring it later if he wanted to see it, and he agreed since the story bothered him. She said she would return in an hour after finishing her walk. Braden stayed near the bench and looked around the clearing while replaying her account. The flowers suddenly felt more significant, and he remembered a local post from late 2020 that mentioned a missing runner who often paused near that same bench. He opened an archived article on his phone and saw a blurred photo of the bench with a date stamp. His stomach tightened when he noticed the same pattern of flowers near the legs. He walked closer to the tree line and saw a strip of cloth caught on a branch. He reached up and pulled it free, and he noticed faint mud streaks along the fabric. He placed it on the bench and took a photo for his own record. He had done informal volunteer searches before, and he knew documenting small clues mattered when nothing else made sense. A man in his late 50s entered the clearing and stopped near the bench. He introduced himself as Arvin Drexler, a retired surveyor who lived across the road from the trail. He asked if Braden was looking into the disappearances tied to the area. Braden said he was only trying to understand what happened near the bench. Arvin nodded and said he had seen similar details across several years, and each case started with someone stopping to rest. Arvin pointed to a narrow gap in the trees where old markers hung from metal hooks. He said the markers were part of an abandoned drainage project from the early 2010s. He explained that the project left several deep maintenance pits that were never fully filled, and he believed people may have fallen into an access point hidden under thick brush. Braden asked if he ever reported that theory. Arvin said he tried, but no one followed up due to limited staff and unclear evidence. Maren returned with the notebook in her hand, and she gave it to Braden. The cover felt worn, and several pages had faint impressions of older notes. He flipped through and found a short line written on the last page. It said, "Met them again by the bench after nightfall." The handwriting looked shaky, and the ink appeared fresh compared to the other pages. Braden asked where exactly she found it. She said it had been wedged between 2 boards under the far side of the bench. Arvin leaned closer and said he had never seen anyone place a notebook there, which made him think the writer returned recently. Braden felt the temperature shift and noticed a faint draft coming from the gap in the trees. He walked toward the marked area and pushed aside thick branches. Beneath the fallen brush, he found a concrete lip with rusted bolts. The ground dipped sharply, and a hollow space opened several feet below. He knelt and used his phone light to check for movement. He saw only old tools and a broken ladder, yet something about the depth made his pulse race. He called out to ask if anyone was down there. No one answered, but a weak echo carried the sound back. Maren suggested checking the other side of the pit for a safer angle. They circled the clearing, and Arvin pointed to a collapsed section of fencing that partially covered another opening. Braden cleared some branches, and he spotted a shoe near the edge. The rubber looked worn, and the sole pattern matched a detail from the runner case he had read earlier. He carefully reached for it, and he noticed dry mud around the heel. Braden asked Arvin to hold his phone while he photographed the shoe. Maren stepped back to avoid disturbing the area, and she scanned the surrounding branches for more fabric. She pointed to another strip caught on a higher limb, which matched the cloth Braden found earlier. They connected the pieces and realized someone had likely moved through the gap with enough force to tear clothing. Braden called a non-emergency line and reported the discovery. He gave general details without naming the notebook and said he believed an old maintenance pit posed danger to visitors. A dispatcher said someone would check the site later, though no estimate was given. That answer frustrated Braden, and he decided to take additional photos to support the claim. As he prepared to leave, he noticed the flowers again and realized each bunch marked dates close to older missing person reports. He photographed the flowers and compared their spacing to the article images. The match felt close enough to suggest someone used the bench as a memorial or a signal. Marin suggested the writer of the notebook might have met someone connected to those flowers, and the line about meeting them again could imply repeated encounters. Braden opened the notebook once more and touched the last page. He noticed tiny indent marks above the line that hinted at a torn message. He angled the page toward the light and saw faint shapes. It looked like someone had written a location reference before removing the sheet. He took a close photo, planning to use editing tools later to enhance the impressions. They decided to walk the perimeter of the clearing before leaving, and Arvin guided them to an older fire road behind the benches. The road had cracked pavement and faded tape lines. He said he once saw a person wearing a reflective vest walking that area at night during 2018. He never identified the person, but he remembered the pattern on the vest matched old county uniforms that were discontinued years earlier. Braden connected that detail to the notebook entry and wondered if the writer had followed someone who claimed to inspect the trail. Marin said the county stopped sending inspectors to that area due to limited funding, which made the sighting even stranger. Arvin agreed and said the person may have used an old uniform to avoid suspicion. They returned to the bench, and Braden looked at the wooden boards where the notebook had been found. He noticed scrape marks near the underside. He slid a hand under the frame and found a small metal clip. It felt loose, and he pulled gently. A folded paper slipped out and landed on the ground. He unfolded it and read a short handwritten note that said, "Follow the lights near the cutoff after dark." The writing matched the notebook. Marin covered her mouth and said the message made her think someone used small lights to guide visitors toward the maintenance pit. Arvin said he once saw flickering lights near the cutoff during late 2019, but assumed they were kids playing with flashlights. Braden realized the lights may have lured curious people toward the gap. They stood silently as the idea settled. The disappearances could have been accidents caused by a hidden pit and a misleading light source. The writer of the notebook may have followed the lights and nearly fell or witnessed someone else fall. Braden suggested the writer tore out the earlier page to give it to someone, possibly a friend or an officer, yet the person never turned it in. A faint gust moved through the clearing, and Braden felt uneasy again. He gathered the notebook and folded note, and he said he would deliver them to the local station as soon as possible. Marin said she would provide her statement about seeing the notebook drop 2 days earlier. Arvin agreed to guide officers to the pit if needed. They walked back toward the parking area while discussing safer trail access. Braden looked over his shoulder at the bench, and he felt a strange pull. The bench had been a quiet place for years, yet its role in 5 disappearances seemed tied to simple mistakes, hidden hazards, and poorly understood signals left by an unknown person. The truth felt less like a supernatural mystery and more like a chain of overlooked warnings. Braden left the park with a steady resolve to push for a full inspection. He believed the answers were already there in the bench, in the flowers, and in the fragments of notes hidden under old boards. The truth only needed patient eyes to connect what had been ignored, and he hoped the next visitor would find the trail safer once those connections reached the right people. The stories. Never take the shortcut behind the closed factory. The old shortcut behind the closed factory had a reputation that reportedly dated back to the early 2000s. Local reports described strange audio picked up by nearby delivery cameras during quiet nights when almost no one walked there. A worker named Lyron Strayed, who was 34 and handled maintenance jobs across small industrial sites, first heard those claims during a routine shift. He did not care much because his focus that day was finishing a late repair, then getting home before midnight. His route usually stayed along the main road, which felt safer and better lit. That changed when a dispatcher called near the end of his shift and asked for a quick check on a generator that kept tripping alarms. The generator sat near the old factory's fence line, which meant he had to park close to the edge of the blocked shortcut. He grabbed his tool bag and walked toward the unit while thinking about the shortcut stories he had ignored for years. The generator itself looked fine, though the alarm reset kept glitching in a way that suggested a loose internal relay. Lyron unscrewed the panel and ran a simple line test, which showed steady current without major issues. He decided the alarm might be reacting to stray interference from another unit placed years earlier near the empty factory. He stepped around the corner to inspect the older unit and noticed something unusual on the dirt path behind the fence. Fresh tire marks cut through the narrow corridor that was supposed to be locked and unused. He checked the fence and found the chain wrapped but not fully secured, like someone had looped it quickly without snapping the lock. Lyron returned to his truck for a small flashlight and snapped 2 photos of the fence for his report. He wanted to note it in case building management had missed scheduled security checks. When he stepped back toward the generator, his radio crackled with a faint, distorted signal that did not match the dispatch channel he normally heard. He held the radio higher and listened as the interference grew stronger. A voice whispered a short phrase that sounded like an address fragment, though the last part cut out sharply. He checked his phone to compare signal strength, yet noticed a timestamp glitch on his call log that he had never seen before. He documented that odd timestamp with another photo, then continued to follow the tire tracks just far enough to understand their direction. They ran straight toward a collapsed loading ramp behind the factory that had not been accessed since a structural inspection during 1999. The ground around the ramp looked disturbed, like heavy weight had pressed into softened soil. He decided to notify dispatch from his truck, but his radio remained unstable even after he switched frequencies twice. A high-pitched tone hit suddenly, forcing him to hold the device farther from his ear. When the tone stopped, the radio returned to silence, and his screen lit with a brief recorded notification that did not belong to his model. Lyron scrolled through the message and found a short, archived clip that showed poor-quality video from an unknown camera. The clip displayed the same loading ramp he had just examined. A figure moved across the screen, but disappeared mid-frame like the feed had dropped instantly. He drove closer to the edge of the shortcut and shut off his headlights to see the area better. The last street lamp flickered, producing uneven light over the ramp and fence. He kept his phone ready for an emergency call. He also reviewed his earlier photos because he wanted a clearer sense of the path shape before stepping near it again. Details he overlooked became clearer with a second look. The tire tracks overlapped an older set of boot prints that moved in the opposite direction toward the outer road. Those prints looked narrow and deep, like someone had walked quickly while carrying a heavy load. He checked the soil near his boots and found similar compression marks that matched the archived clip patterns almost exactly. He took more pictures and followed the tracks until he reached a corroded service door near the ramp. The door sat slightly open, though crews had sealed it with metal brackets during 2006. He pushed gently and felt resistance from warped hinges rather than any locking mechanism. Inside, the air smelled stale, and dust covered most surfaces. His light caught the outline of a forklift abandoned long ago, though the tire dust pattern suggested recent movement that did not match the machine's dead battery state. He lifted the engine cover briefly and saw untouched corrosion that proved the forklift had not operated recently, which made the tracks outside even stranger. Near the back wall, he found a stack of handwritten notes taped to a cabinet. The pages carried dates from the late 2000s and documented repeated complaints about unauthorized after-hours activity. One note mentioned an unidentified van entering through the same corridor that created the tire marks he saw. Another described auditory anomalies inside the building, captured by a security mic later removed during an equipment reduction. He copied the notes by taking photos and moved to the other end of the room where a damaged camera hung loose. The camera's data card remained inside, though the casing had cracked. He removed the card carefully and placed it inside an evidence pouch he kept for documenting property damage. The pouch kept dust-off sensitive parts, which might help tech staff recover something useful. When he stepped outside again, he noticed the street lamp flickering faster. A shadow crossed the ramp area, though no one appeared nearby. He raised his flashlight and scanned slowly until the beam caught a piece of torn reflective tape stuck to the fence. The tape matched a style used by highway crews in the early 2000s and had similar aging patterns to tape visible in the archived clip. He returned to his truck to call dispatch again and finally reached a stable connection. The dispatcher listened, then pulled up 2 old maintenance logs that referenced unusual trespassing during night shifts between 2003 and 2008. Those logs mentioned a possible smuggling route using the service door before the factory closed. The route was believed sealed after the inspection in 2006, but no follow-up confirmation existed. Lyron asked the dispatcher to check one more detail, specifically whether any recent patrol cars had reported activity near the shortcut. She checked and found a brief report from earlier that evening. A driver claimed he saw a van enter the far side of the blocked road, though no vehicle appeared on traffic cams afterward. He finished his call and walked back toward the generator to close his initial work order. The radio interference returned, but softer, almost like the earlier voice had weakened. He waited to see if anything else came through. Only a faint click repeated twice, matching the distortion pattern from the archived clip. Before leaving, he photographed the loading ramp again, along with the surrounding soil. When he reviewed the new images, he saw a fresh indentation near the forklift room entrance, as if someone or something had stepped there after he exited. The shape looked too narrow for a normal boot, but aligned perfectly with the print glimpse seen in the archived clip. He left the site carefully and locked the outer gate before sending all photos and the data card to the tech department. He then wrote a detailed report describing each anomaly exactly as he observed it. His findings matched older complaints closely, creating a pattern that suggested someone had been using the closed corridor long after the factory shut down. The next morning, the tech team confirmed the data card contained partial footage from 2 nights earlier that showed the same shadow crossing the loading ramp. They also discovered faint audio that matched the strange voice Lyron heard through his radio. It repeated the same clipped address fragment that had confused him near the generator. Investigators later checked that fragment and found it corresponded to an unregistered storage lot once connected to the factory by a freight contract during the late 1990s. The lot had changed ownership several times without clear documentation, which explained why no record connected it to the shortcut corridor anymore. Lyron stayed involved through follow-up calls for several weeks. His report became part of a larger inquiry into abandoned freight routes that still carried untracked activity. The case remained unofficial because none of the evidence pointed to a clear suspect or purpose. It only showed movement that had restarted for unknown reasons. He sometimes drove past the site after work and noticed the city had installed better locks and stronger lights. The shortcut no longer flickered with the eerie randomness that greeted him that night. He never again heard the distorted voice or saw odd timestamps on his radio displays. The experience left him cautious about places that looked abandoned but still carried signs of movement. He understood how easily someone could miss tiny clues unless the light hit them at the right angle. Every tire, track, shadow, and flicker had pointed to something real that operated quietly in the gaps between forgotten structures. He still thinks about the warning he heard from older workers who told him to avoid that corridor. Their stories felt exaggerated back then, yet the evidence he gathered proved there was always something strange behind the closed factory. The stories. Never open the locker marked "staff only" at this pool. It was reported that an old community pool kept one locker sealed during every shift, which matched the warning painted on its door. Local staff claimed the warning came from an incident in the early 2010s that never made public records. On a warm morning in late July 2019, a 28-year-old lifeguard named Rylan Keene started his first full weekend shift. He worked part-time at the pool while finishing a safety certification course, and he had a simple plan that day. He wanted to close early, finish his paperwork, and head home before the evening rush. The pool sat near a quiet suburb, and most regular visitors arrived with kids who stayed close to the shallow end. Rylan checked the schedule board, then walked along the lockers behind the staff counter while sipping a cheap canned coffee. He noticed a metal locker that looked older than the rest, and its front carried the words "staff only" in faded red paint. The manager had already mentioned the locker during training, stating that nobody should open it since the last documented key went missing years earlier. Reports from retired employees suggested the door once belonged to the maintenance area, although the structure behind it had been remodeled in 2008. Rylan always thought the story was exaggerated to keep kids from sneaking inside. That morning, he heard a dull rattle from the locker, which felt unusual since no one stored equipment there. He tapped the metal surface with 2 knuckles and heard something shift inside. He looked around the empty hallway and said quietly, "Anyone stuck in there?" which made no sense because the locker was too narrow for a person. The sound stopped, then a faint thud followed, which tightened the idea that maybe an animal had crawled in through the back. Rylan fetched a flashlight from the front desk and returned to inspect the vent near the locker base. Dust coated the grate, and nothing suggested active airflow. He crouched lower but noticed a small slip of paper on the floor, folded twice with the edges stiff from moisture. It looked recently placed and carried a quick note reading, "Check logs before closing time." The handwriting looked rushed, and he recognized none of the staff who wrote like that. He placed the note in his pocket and opened the office drawer where old incident binders were kept. The logs from 2011 through 2014 were thin, while the binder labeled 2015 through 2017 held several handwritten entries from night shifts. One entry from late August 2015 described a report of heavy knocking from behind the old locker. The guard wrote that he radioed a supervisor, then waited 15 minutes before the noise stopped. Another entry from early June 2017 mentioned a staffer who claimed to hear a voice calling for help from inside the wall. The supervisor at the time marked both events as unverified due to limited evidence. Rylan read further and found an archived maintenance note claiming the original access hallway behind the locker had been closed after a small structural collapse in 2010. Workers sealed the area with sheet metal and advised future crews to avoid disturbing it. The description matched the dimensions of the locker, so it seemed the locker mostly existed to cover the patch. Before he could finish the binder, a regular swimmer named Tala Pembry approached the desk to ask about the lap lane schedule. She was in her 40s and visited nearly every morning. She noticed the binder and said, "You checking the old disturbance files," which caught him by surprise because he had not mentioned anything. She explained that she swam here in 2010 when the collapse happened. She remembered a construction light falling behind the wall and a worker yelling that someone was still inside the hallway. Tala claimed she never heard what happened afterward, and she said the staff acted nervous for weeks. Rylan asked what she remembered about the worker. She paused, then said, "He was young, maybe early 20s, before walking toward the changing rooms." Her voice shook slightly, as if she had debated sharing more. He returned to the hallway with the locker and listened again. There was no sound now, only the faint buzz of old fluorescent bulbs. He reached for the handle and felt a cold vibration that did not match the ambient temperature. He stepped back and considered calling the manager, but he knew the manager would say it was nothing more than old pipes. Rylan spent the next hour monitoring the pool and checking the locker during each sweep. At 2 in the afternoon, the note in his pocket felt heavier somehow. He unfolded it again and noticed that the ink looked smeared, almost as if the message had been written minutes earlier rather than hours ago. He checked the front desk computer for any digital archive of maintenance calls near that structure. The system showed a report from 2019, only 4 months old, where a staff member logged hearing metal scraping behind the locker. The entry stated that the scraping stopped when they stepped closer. Later that afternoon, an older groundskeeper named Ward Leston entered the office to collect spare filters. Ward had worked there for more than 15 years and kept a quiet personality. Rylan decided to ask him directly about the locker. Ward froze for a second, then said, "Leave that alone. Someone got hurt behind that door long ago, and the place never settled right." He refused to explain further and left with the filters without another word. With every hour passing, the hallway felt heavier, as if the air thickened around the locker. Around 5:30, the pool emptied, and a soft tapping came from the metal door. Rylan tightened his grip on the flashlight and said, "If there is an animal inside, I have to check before closing." The tapping shifted into a sliding sound, as if something moved downward. He leaned close and whispered, "Do you need help?" which felt ridiculous, but came out naturally. To his shock, a weak voice answered through the thin panel. It sounded like a scared young man saying, "I am stuck in the hall," followed by a strained cough. Rylan jumped back, then approached again and said, "I will get help. Stay calm." He ran toward the maintenance shed and grabbed a crowbar, then returned with his pulse racing. He wedged the tool under the corner and pried, expecting the metal to bend easily. Instead, the locker door lifted sharply on its own, almost like someone had tugged it from the inside. A sharp burst of cold air hit his face as the door cracked open by less than an inch. He pointed the flashlight through the gap and saw a narrow cavity behind the metal panel. It looked like an old service corridor lined with dusty concrete. At the far end, he spotted a reflective surface that resembled a safety vest, and the faint voice called again, saying, "Please pull me out." The corridor seemed impossibly deep compared to the thickness of the wall, which caused him to recoil in confusion. Seconds later, his radio crackled by itself with heavy static that drowned all pool noise. The corridor darkened as if an unseen shadow moved closer, and the vest shape disappeared completely. The voice stopped mid-sentence, and the temperature dropped sharply, making his arms shake. He stepped backward, and the locker door slammed shut with a force that echoed through the empty hallway. He tried the handle again, but it would not budge, and the flashlight died without warning. He backed away and held his breath as the building settled. No further sounds came from the locker. Dispatch logs later stated that he reported the incident at 6:10 in the evening, though the call lasted only 9 seconds before the line failed. Management inspected the locker the next morning, but found no evidence of a corridor or any exposed space. They claimed the interior showed only plywood backing and sealed insulation. Rylan insisted on what he saw, but the staff reminded him that the structure behind the locker had been permanently filled. He wrote a full report, which was stored with older, unexplained events. Weeks later, a former construction worker visited the pool to repair a broken gate. When Ryland described the voice, the worker asked if it sounded like a man named Astor Holt, who went missing during the 2010 collapse. Records suggested he entered the service hall before the accident, though recovery teams never found him. The worker whispered that some crews believed the hall never sealed completely, and the pool carried echoes from that gap. Ryland eventually left the job, but he kept the original folded note as uneasy proof of that day. The locker remains bolted shut, and new staff are told the same warning he once ignored. Some visitors claim they still hear tapping near closing time, though it stops the moment anyone acknowledges it. For anyone walking those quiet hallways, the warning on the locker remains clear. Never open the locker marked staff only at this pool. The stories. The mine shaft everyone avoids after one winter shift. Hushed stories about a troubled winter shift lingered around an old mining town where people rarely challenged its harsh land. Locals claimed the trouble began after a night when a minor accident exposed something deeper than ice inside an abandoned shaft. Ryder Halden was 34 and worked as a maintenance tech for a small mining contractor that handled seasonal repairs. He arrived in the area during early winter to inspect older ventilation lines after a storm damaged several service roads. He hoped to finish his tasks fast because he planned to drive south before deeper snow arrived. His simple goal was to check the inactive shaft called Northcut and file a routine report that usually required little effort. The incident started when Ryder reached the frozen service trail and noticed fresh tire marks that did not match company vehicles. He studied the tracks because they curved sharply near the locked entrance, and he felt annoyed since trespassing caused delays. He followed the marks for a short distance and found the company padlock on the gate sitting open in the snow. That immediately changed his plan because an unlocked gate meant he needed to walk inside and confirm that no one had entered recently. The complication grew once he stepped into the dim first chamber and heard a steady tapping sound echoing from deeper tunnels. Ryder paused because the mine had been inactive for more than 10 years, according to archived maintenance logs stored in the base office. He tried to convince himself that melting ice caused the noise, yet the tapping kept a slow rhythm that felt intentional. Nearby walls held old chalk markings that matched diagrams found in earlier reports, though he spotted one new line that seemed recently drawn. He documented the finding with his work phone because unusual markings required clear evidence for supervisors. The photo captured a faint boot print beside the chalk line, and that raised his concern further. Ryder checked the archived inspection sheets stored on the local server earlier that morning, and none mentioned any recent site visits other than his. He decided to walk deeper because standard protocol ordered a full sweep whenever unauthorized signs appeared. He carried a small lantern since the wired lights no longer functioned after their power source was removed several years prior. During his investigation, he followed the tapping while keeping his pace slow, and he noticed the pattern shift whenever he stopped moving. Ryder wondered if frozen beams strained under winter pressure, yet the sound seemed too controlled to match structural stress. The tunnel floor held dusty rail tracks once used for small carts, and he saw scattered debris that did not appear in previous photos taken during a 2018 inspection. Among the pieces, he noticed a bent metal badge with faded lettering that seemed older than the shutdown date. He recorded its location because older equipment sometimes surfaced during thaw periods, and supervisors liked accurate notes. The tapping finally ceased near a narrow drop that led to a secondary shaft called split turn, according to age diagrams. Ryder checked archived calls from the company emergency line on his tablet because the area once hosted minor cave-ins, and he found one brief report from 2009 that mentioned a missing day laborer whose case ended without clear closure. The record did not list a name, and Ryder assumed it was a typical incomplete file from seasonal hiring cycles. Still, the timing of the tapping felt too strange and forced him to rethink his assumptions about the site. He crouched near the drop and shined his lantern downward, where he spotted a small fabric scrap wedged between two beams. The scrap looked newer than the surrounding decay, and he recognized the color because it matched safety jackets issued during recent winter shifts at the company depot. Ryder felt uneasy because no crew members reported missing gear that month, and the depot logs showed no issued jackets beyond standard signouts. He reached for the scrap carefully and noticed dried dirt on its underside, along with faint char marks that resembled contact with a heated surface. As he studied the scrap, a distant metallic clang echoed from behind him, which made him turn quickly. Ryder called out for any possible trespasser, and his voice bounced through the tunnels without a reply. He replayed earlier photos on his phone to compare debris positions, and he realized a thin wooden plank on the floor behind him now leaned at a sharper angle. He felt certain he did not touch it earlier, so he took another photo, planning to discuss it with security because possible movement indicated human presence or shifting beams. Ryder climbed out of the narrow section and moved toward the first chamber, using the lantern to check each corner. On the way, he discovered a shallow scrape on the wall that looked freshly made, and the chalky dust sat loose on the ground below it. He checked his steps carefully because he wanted to avoid contaminating the scene before proper documentation. He snapped a photo and noted its timestamp for supervisors, who required clear tracking of each entry detail. As he reached the first chamber, the cold air felt sharper and carried a faint burnt scent that had not been present earlier. Ryder scanned the floor for heat sources but found only patches of frost that melted near the gate. He felt confused because the temperature should have dropped consistently inside an inactive shaft during winter storms. His attention returned to the open padlock because fresh scarring around its hinge suggested someone forced it quickly rather than using a key. He stepped outside and followed the tire tracks up the service trail. The sun hung low and gave the snow an orange tint that made details easier to spot. Ryder found a second set of prints beside the tire marks, which looked like boots with shallow tread, and the stride pattern suggested a slow walk. He recorded this because incidents involving unauthorized visitors required complete documentation for liability protection. The prints led toward a bend where the snow deepened around an old equipment shed with a cracked metal roof. At the shed, he found the door slightly ajar and signs of recent activity like disturbed dust and dragged footprints. Ryder pushed the door open and found a large portable heater tipped on its side with a melted patch around its vent. The heater model matched units removed from service years earlier due to overheating risks, and he knew they remained stored at a warehouse miles away. Ryder checked the shed floor and found more scraps of the same jacket material he collected earlier, which suggested a link to the heater incident. Tapping returned faintly from the direction of the mine, which forced him to choose between returning to safety or completing his sweep. He paused because protocol permitted retreat when structural risks arose, yet he believed the evidence required a clearer connection. Ryder replayed the metallic clang in his mind and concluded that the noise did not match natural stress shifts. He walked back toward the gate with steady steps while comparing earlier tire tracks to ensure no new marks appeared during his absence. Inside the chamber again, Ryder traced the tapping to a side tunnel sealed during the 2009 incident mentioned in archived calls. The seal consisted of old boards nailed across the tunnel mouth, yet one board sagged as if recently disturbed. He lifted his lantern and saw soot on the edges that resembled the heater melt pattern from the shed. Ryder removed gloves and checked the temperature of the soot but found it cold, which meant the disturbance happened earlier. Behind the boards, he noticed another chalk mark shaped like a short horizontal line above a circle. He tried to recall earlier diagrams and realized this symbol appeared in a forgotten annex report describing temporary holding zones used for equipment staging. Ryder removed a loose board and peered into the dark opening where he saw a narrow pit with metal fragments scattered along its base. Among them, he saw a torn patch of the same jacket color that seemed older with deeper dirt embedded in its fibers. He lowered his lantern deeper and noticed something else. A structural support beam bore a fresh dent shaped like the corner of a heater casing. He understood then that someone tried to use older gear to heat part of the tunnel, possibly to locate or free something buried under the pit. This linked the heater scrap, soot marks, and scorch on the jacket pieces into a single sequence, suggesting a recent search attempt. Ryder backed away because he realized the person or people involved might still be nearby. Before leaving, he noticed his lantern flicker and then regain strength. The tapping stopped again, which heightened his urgency. Ryder stepped out into the open trail and felt the frozen wind strike harder as he reached his truck. He contacted dispatch and requested a site lockdown due to signs of unauthorized entry and possible hazardous activity. Dispatch promised to send a team after sunrise since travel remained dangerous during heavy winter. A follow-up investigation reportedly found additional heater fragments inside the shed, along with prints that matched no employees. Witness statements from nearby residents mentioned a person seen in a bright jacket entering the service trail 2 nights earlier. No one confirmed the identity, and footage from an old roadside camera offered only a blurred outline walking toward the gate. The pit area remained sealed after teams scanned it with ground sensors that detected minor voids but no confirmed remains or trapped equipment. Ryder later reviewed his photos and noted that the chalk symbol above the circle matched older maps that marked forgotten test zones unrelated to recorded accidents. Supervisors concluded that someone might have misinterpreted the old reports and attempted an unapproved search inside the shaft. They reinforced the gate and added warning signs that urged people to avoid the trail during winter shifts. To this day, the mine shaft remains closed, and locals still talk about the tapping that drifted through it that season. Ryder kept his notes stored on his tablet because he believed the sounds came from shifting beams rather than any hidden person. Yet he understood why others felt uneasy when passing that trail, especially when winter storms made the land crack and echo in unpredictable ways. The stories. The fisherman who kept hearing his name over the radio. Evan Carr spent most mornings on the narrow inlet where the water carried old radio chatter from nearby boats. Local crews reported that odd transmissions sometimes drifted through that stretch, and many believed they came from abandoned gear left after storms. He treated those stories like tired dock rumors until one calm morning changed his thinking. Evan was 38 and worked as a small-scale fisherman who supplied a few markets inland. He kept his aluminum skiff tied near the inlet because the currents stayed gentle and the tides rarely pushed hard. He headed out around sunrise on a day in early summer 2019 with a simple goal to check crab pots he set the night before. He liked the quiet and usually ignored the static coming from his battered radio. He started the motor, then steered toward his first buoy, while soft wind pushed light ripples across the inlet. He reached for his thermos when the radio cracked with a burst sharper than usual, which made him pause. Static hissed for several seconds, then a faint voice said his name with a slow, careful tone. It sounded like a person trying to speak through heavy interference. Evan thought it came from a nearby boat because signals often bounced across the water in unpredictable ways. He looked around but saw empty shoreline and one distant trawler that was already moving toward deeper water. The voice repeated his name with the same drawn-out sound, and he felt a sudden cold weight that did not match the warm morning. He tried to answer, but the radio only returned a faint hum that flicked in and out like something powered by a weak battery. He shut the radio off to reset it, then turned it back on, hoping the strange signal would vanish. Instead, he heard a low, rhythmic tapping that reminded him of someone hitting a metal hull in slow, measured beats. Evan finished checking the first pot, but his focus kept drifting to the radio because the voice carried a dull echo that felt unnatural. He tied the pot and planned to finish the rest quickly so he could return to shore where he hoped to test the antenna. The moment he reached for the throttle, the radio shifted again and whispered his name in a tone that sounded closer than before. He headed towards shore while replaying that voice in his mind because it carried an uneasy familiarity he could not place. Dock workers later said he arrived faster than usual and looked tense as he pulled his gear onto the planks. He asked if any boat had called for him that morning, but no one reported a transmission with his name. Evan returned home and wrote down the time of each strange broadcast because he wanted to check older notes he kept on similar events. He found 2 entries from early spring that mentioned brief whispers through the radio shortly after heavy fog settled over the inlet. He ignored them at the time because the fog distorted signals and created odd echoes that bounced between cliffs. He spent the afternoon checking online forums that tracked regional marine frequencies where enthusiasts archived recordings from previous seasons. One contributor posted a thread about ghost transmissions that came from a derelict trawler that sank in the late 2010s after a major storm. According to the thread, the trawler carried a short-range radio that sometimes flickered on during low tide when exposed wiring reacted to saltwater. Witness statements from local patrol crews reported faint voices calling crew names during those periods, though no identity was ever confirmed. Evan noted that detail because the thread mentioned distorted speech patterns that matched his morning experience. He called a friend named Cal Rowan, who worked part-time with a small rescue group, and asked if the inlet held any wrecks near his route. Cal said an old survey map showed one submerged boat that rested near the deeper bend south of the inlet. He offered to meet Evan at the dock so they could check tidal charts and mark the likely location. They met near sunset and compared notes while a light breeze pushed the smell of seaweed across the planks. Cal studied Evan's written times, then said the pattern lined up with a recent series of reports about intermittent transmissions during rising tide. He suggested they record any new signal the next morning using a portable device with stronger range than Evan's aging radio. Evan agreed, even though the idea made him uneasy because the voice felt personal in a way he could not explain. Morning arrived with heavy gray sky as they motored toward the bend marked on the survey map. Evan turned on the recorder while Cal monitored the radio and watched the water shift with the incoming tide. They waited for several minutes before a burst of static cracked through the speaker with a sharp rise that made both men flinch. The voice spoke again and said Evan's name with a tone that now carried a clipped urgency. Cal looked at the recorder, then stared toward the bend because the voice sounded as if it came from somewhere below the surface. Evan gripped the wheel and tried to steady his breathing because something in the tone reminded him of an old coworker who vanished years earlier during a late-season crossing. He mentioned that coworker to Cal, who asked if the man ever sailed near this inlet. Evan said that the coworker named Reed had worked on a small crew that fished along the same coastline in early 2017. Reed later transferred to another vessel that sank during a storm that occurred north of their town. Local reports said the wreck was never fully recovered because shifting sand made the search difficult. Cal suggested they check archived dispatch logs from that storm because crews sometimes reported drifting debris that could help them understand how anything connected to Reed might reach this inlet. They returned to shore and visited a small office where a retired dispatcher kept scanned records from older calls. The dispatcher recognized Evan and allowed them to search a digital folder that stored logs from early 2017. One log described a partial sighting of a damaged trawler hull drifting south several days after the storm. The report said the hull carried broken antennas and fragments of a radio panel that still flickered when exposed to sunlight. A second log mentioned a patrol officer hearing a distant voice through static that repeated a crew name before fading. Evan realized the name in that report matched Reed's last name, but the log did not mention if the voice said anything else. He remembered that Reed had a habit of calling coworkers by last name during early morning shifts when he tried to stay awake. The connection felt loose but too strong to ignore because the timing aligned with the drifting hull. Cal said they should return to the inlet during low tide, because exposed wreckage might reveal old wiring that caused recent broadcasts. Evan agreed, though, his stomach tightened because the voice spoke with increasing clarity each time. They secured the skiff, then returned that afternoon when the tide receded and revealed dark shapes below the bend. They anchored near a shallow patch where twisted metal poked through sand like remnants from the storm. Evan moved closer and saw part of a radio panel caught between two rusted beams with wires trailing into the water. Cal used a long hook to lift a loose section and found a corroded tag that matched the radio model used on Reed's crew during 2017. The radio crackled at that moment, then delivered another faint call of Evan's name, with a tone that now carried slow rising static. Cal recorded the sound while Evan watched the wires shift with the gentle pull of the tide. He understood then that the wrecked panels sometimes connected when saltwater reached the exposed terminals, which created a short burst of power. The burst likely triggered fragments of an old emergency recording that captured voices during the storm. Evan remembered that some crews recorded internal chatter before impact, and those recordings sometimes contained rushed calls that repeated crew names. The voice in his radio may have been part of that final chatter, which echoed through damaged wiring each time conditions aligned. They brought the recording to the dispatcher, who played it through a clearer speaker. The voice echoed sharply, then faded as the static rose, which made the source obvious. It was a broken emergency loop that repeated fragments from a doomed crew's final minutes. The distorted tone made the calls sound directed, but they were simply names, shouted during chaos. Evan felt a heavy release of tension because the mystery carried a painful answer, but at least it was grounded in something real. He asked the dispatcher to contact local authorities so they could mark the wreck and prevent more confusion. Cal agreed and said the inlet should be flagged on new charts for safety. Evan returned to the water the next day and listened to his radio with a calmer mind while checking his crab pots. The inlet felt different because he now understood the source, even though the memory of the voice still lingered. He looked toward the bend where the wreck rested and thought about the crew who never returned. He continued working that season with new respect for the signals that travel across water because each transmission carried a story shaped by time and tide. He did not hear his name again and believed the loop finally failed after years of corrosion. He kept the recording in a drawer at home to remind himself that strange moments sometimes come from simple causes. He knew that calm days on the inlet now carried a quiet steadiness that felt earned after weeks of searching for answers. The stories. What a night janitor found behind the vending machine. Roughly 10 years ago, a late shift incident at a small distribution center led to a report that never reached public records. The file describes something a night janitor found behind a vending machine after a quiet shift turned strange. Rylan Cho worked nights at a regional packing warehouse on the edge of a mid-sized town. He was 37 and had been there almost 7 years. He liked the silence after midnight and usually finished his route with music in his earbuds. On this particular night, in late spring of 2014, he wanted to clock out early and get home before a storm hit the valley. He started in the loading bay with a simple goal for the night. Finish his checklist, empty the bins, and mop the narrow hallway near the break room before the wind picked up outside. The building felt colder than usual, and the air system made a steady hum that covered most small sounds. The incident began around 1:30 in the morning when Rylan passed the break room and saw the vending machine screen flick on by itself. The machine had been glitchy before, so he did not think much of it until he noticed the light did not show the usual bright menu. Instead, it looked dim with a strange gray shimmer moving across the glass. A soft tapping sound came from behind the machine. Rylan stepped closer and asked out loud if someone was stuck. He expected no reply. The tapping repeated 2 times with steady rhythm. He backed up a little and checked the doorway leading to the maintenance hall. No one else should have been there since the last forklift crew left hours earlier. He went to find the shift supervisor but realized he was alone for the next hour since the supervisor had gone to the far lot to handle a truck issue. Rylan returned to the break room and watched the machine again. The shimmer on the screen grew lighter, then faded. He unplugged the power cord to reset it, and the tapping stopped. When he pushed the machine slightly, he felt something resist from behind. The machine sat tight against the wall with no gap. He moved it a few inches and saw a narrow, dark space behind the right side panel. Something metallic glinted inside the space. Rylan grabbed his small work light from the janitor cart and angled the beam toward the opening. A metal box covered with dust sat wedged between the drywall and the machine frame. The box looked old. The lid had a faded sticker with part of a name scratched off. He reached in and pulled it free. Inside were 3 items: a small bound notebook, a thin plastic badge with a photo rubbed almost blank, and an audio recorder the size of a deck of cards. The notebook smelled musty. The first page held uneven handwriting, saying property of Hale Dorn, who worked maintenance from 2003 to 2008 based on a short training archive. Rylan remembered hearing from older staff that Hale left suddenly after a safety investigation. Nothing official remained in the shared files. Most said he moved away. A few said he had filed complaints about strange vibrations near the break room wall. Rylan opened the notebook carefully. The first entry from early 2006 described recurring knocking sounds near the vending machine as well as faint static pulses in the wall during night shifts. Hale wrote that he made several unofficial recordings, but none stayed consistent when reviewed later. The next entries grew more detailed. Hale noted timestamps, short sketches of sound waves, and small maps of the hallway layout. One entry from late 2006 described a night when the machine screen flickered with a gray wash, similar to what Rylan had seen hours earlier. Hale wrote that the tapping seemed to follow his movements around the room. Rylan turned to the last written page, dated mid-2007. It read, "I need to get someone to check the wiring before this gets worse." The lines after that looked rushed. Hale wrote that he found a small access hole behind the machine with a narrow duct running into the maintenance room. He believed air pressure changes inside the duct caused some of the sounds. The next note stated, "I still hear something moving in there, although the duct should be empty." Rylan set the notebook down and inspected the audio recorder. It contained a small tape with a handwritten label that read, "Night Shift Sample 2." He slipped it into his pocket with the plan to listen later under better light. He then checked the badge. The image showed Hale with short hair and tired eyes. The back listed his role as maintenance support. Rylan pushed the machine farther from the wall to look for the duct mentioned in the notes. A narrow circular opening near the baseboard revealed an old service channel that ran behind several rooms. It had not been used in years based on the dust and cobwebs. The channel connected to the maintenance room and likely carried air back when the building used a different system. He crouched closer and felt a cool draft from deep inside the channel. The draft moved in a steady pulse instead of a constant stream. When he leaned nearer, he heard a faint scrape, followed by two soft taps. He jumped back and called out if anyone was inside. No reply followed. Ryland stood still and waited for another sound. 3 minutes passed quietly. He reached into the opening with the work light and shined the beam across the first few feet. Dust floated in the narrow space and nothing moved. The scrape sound did not repeat. He repositioned the vending machine and photographed the channel opening so he could show the supervisor. He then finished his route feeling uneasy. When his shift ended at 3, he took the notebook and recorder home. Later that afternoon, he listened to the tape. It began with low background hum, likely from the old air system. 30 seconds in, a rhythmic tapping started. It matched the pattern Rylan heard earlier. The tapping repeated 4 times, then stopped. Hale's voice spoke quietly, saying, "I know the duct is empty, yet it keeps making that pattern." The tape ended with a short, static burst. Ryland cross-checked the tape with archived maintenance logs from 2006 available through an internal server. He found a note about air pressure complaints near the break room, but no follow-up reports. The log mentioned Hale's concern about a possible leak inside the service channel and recommended an inspection that never occurred. Ryland met with the supervisor the next night and showed the findings. The supervisor listened to part of the tape and agreed that the sound pattern matched what past crews mentioned during older shifts. He filed a report to the facilities manager, who arranged a full inspection later that week. The inspection team removed the vending machine and opened the service channel. They found a partially detached metal flap deep inside that moved when the air system cycled. The flap created repeated taps during pressure changes, which explained the pattern recorded by Hale. Inspectors also found old tools left behind by a previous contractor, which caused the scrape Rylan heard. The team sealed the channel, repaired the flap, and recommended replacing the vending machine wiring due to aging components that caused the strange screen flicker reported by both Hale and Rylan. 2 weeks later, the warehouse returned to normal. The tapping never came back. The recording was archived inside a general maintenance file, and the notebook was stored with other historical documents kept for internal reference. Ryland kept thinking about how one small discovery behind a vending machine connected him to someone who tried to document the same odd sounds years earlier. He believed Hale had tried to solve a problem that no one else seemed to notice until the notes surfaced again. The story lives quietly inside a handful of reports, and one old tape that proves how simple overlooked issues can create experiences that feel much stranger than they are, especially during long nights when empty hallways amplify every sound. Corin prepared to leave, and he secured the logbook under his arm because he planned to hand it over to the harbor office. As he reached the ground floor, he heard a deep thud from above, like something heavy striking the metal railing. He looked up the stairwell and saw dust drifting through the pale air, and he called out in a steady voice, asking if anyone needed help. No reply came, and he hurried outside because the building felt wrong. The fog had thickened into a wall that blocked the path back to town, and he saw a faint glow near the rocks as though the skiff lights flickered through the mist. He considered walking toward the beach, and he radioed the harbor office with a brief report of strange activity near the tower. Dispatch logs indicate that Corin's transmission cut off mid-sentence, and the signal ended with a burst of static. A search team followed the path an hour later, and they found his tool pack near the lighthouse door, but not his radio or the logbook. Witness statements described drifting voices on the water that night, and one crew member claimed he saw a dim lantern moving inside the tower. The unsigned log discovered months later matched the fragments found in Corin's notes, and investigators believed the entries were written over several days. They concluded that the skiff likely struck a submerged ledge, and they suspected Corin attempted to reach survivors through the dense fog. No further entries appeared after the final line mentioning the figure on the gallery. The lighthouse remains closed today, and the tower stands quiet during most storms. Local crews say the watchroom light sometimes flickers during heavy fog, and they assume it is faulty wiring from years of neglect. The final log stays in a small archive where the pages still show faint stains from salt air and old sea fog, and the case sits unsolved with quiet respect for the missing caretaker. The stories. What's buried beneath that motel parking lot? In 2013, a small highway motel outside a rural town gained quiet attention after workers found strange soil layers under fresh asphalt. The case never reached headlines, but locals still mention it when strange noises come from the empty lot at night. The story centers on Rylan Mercer, who was 29 and worked as a nighttime maintenance tech at the old roadside place. He lived in a small room near the supply shed and handled plumbing issues plus late check-ins during slow months. On a chilly night in early autumn, he planned to replace worn bulbs along the back walkway before closing the service desk. He walked out toward the alley where the lot met a row of overgrown trees that blocked wind from the highway. He carried a small tool bag and wanted to finish the job before storms reached the ridge. He heard gravel shift under a passing truck but ignored it and kept moving toward the flickering lights. The first incident happened when he tried to pull a ladder from storage and felt the ground dip under his feet with a dull cracking sound. He stepped back fast because the asphalt felt soft in one oddly shaped patch near an older drainage grate. He knelt with caution and pushed a screwdriver into the crack, but found soil that felt looser than normal fill. Rylan went inside and wrote a brief note about the issue, because the motel owner wanted records of every minor repair. He grabbed a flashlight and returned outside to check the area again, since guests sometimes reported old pipes vibrating under the lot. He pressed his heel against the weakened spot and felt a faint vibration that did not match normal pipe flow. The complication grew after he asked an older guest named Hollis Grant if he had heard unusual sounds during his stay. Hollis said he heard steady tapping under the pavement around midnight 2 nights earlier. He said the tapping felt rhythmic in a slow pattern that reminded him of someone knocking through thin wood. Rylan wrote the detail in his small notebook because he wanted a full record for the owner. The next morning, he looked at archived maintenance logs stored in a dusty drawer near the office printer. He found an entry from 2009 that noted settling issues under the same section of the lot without any follow-up record. The note simply said that workers filled a shallow dip with recycled asphalt after heavy rain, but never investigated deeper layers. He walked back outside and scraped away loose chunks of pavement until he reached a thin patch of older concrete mixed with cracked gravel. He noticed faint marks in the old material that looked like parallel lines spaced evenly in a pattern similar to a box lid. He pushed his flashlight beam through the cracks and saw a dark void below the thin concrete sheet. Rylan called his friend Linton Fry, who worked part-time with a local cleanup crew that handled abandoned structures. Linton arrived after lunch and helped test the hollow area with a short steel rod used for soil checks. The rod dropped several inches into the void and produced a hollow thump that sounded too sharp for natural erosion pockets. Rylan felt uneasy but wanted clear evidence before alerting the owner. They cut a small square in the weakened concrete using an old rotary tool from the supply shed. Dust scattered across gravel as the square lifted with surprising ease. Underneath was compacted dirt mixed with thin scraps of plastic that looked melted by heat. Rylan reached in and pulled out a small strip with faded printing that looked like part of a safety warning from older storage bins. The deeper investigation started when Rylan found an old photo taped inside the maintenance log he borrowed from 2009. The photo showed the lot before renovations in 2006 and included a small storage cabin that no longer existed. A handwritten note on the back said the cabin caught fire during a storm, but details were never shared with newer staff. Rylan asked the owner about it, but only received a quiet answer that the cabin was removed after a minor electrical issue. Rylan then checked archived dispatch logs stored at the county library and found a brief call from July 2006 that reported a small fire near a roadside property matching the motel's mile marker. The call mentioned unknown materials stored inside an abandoned cabin that smoldered before firefighters cleared debris. No injuries were reported, but the log said a chemical odor lingered during the cleanup. He returned to the void under the lot and dug deeper with a small garden trowel he kept for landscaping tasks. 2 inches down, he uncovered brittle wood fibers coated in a hardened black residue that smelled faintly metallic. Linton suggested the residue looked similar to burned plastic from older industrial crates. They kept digging until the trowel struck a thin metal edge shaped like a corner bracket. They widened the hole and exposed a rectangular metal frame with charred wood inside, almost like a collapsed storage box left under the ground during repaving. Rylan found a faded barcode sticker fused to the metal, but the numbers were unreadable, except for the last 3 digits, which appeared as 416. He checked supplier records from the motel office and saw older inventory tags that used long strings, ending with the same 3 digits. The tags belonged to a discontinued supplier that shipped chemical cleaning agents in reinforced boxes. The twist came when Rylan realized the rhythmic tapping reported by Hollis might connect to shifting air pockets trapped under warped metal panels. He tested the theory by placing a board over the hollow section and stepping on different spots. Each step produced a soft knock from moving metal that echoed through the buried frame. The tapping was not from a person, but from trapped panels flexing after years of underground corrosion. He called the motel owner again with all findings and explained that the lot might contain remnants of a burned supply cabin that crews buried instead of removing fully during renovations. The owner sighed and admitted he purchased the property after the fire and assumed everything had been cleared by the previous crew. He agreed to bring in a licensed team to remove remaining material. When the cleanup team started work, they found several melted storage boxes that had fused together during the 2006 fire. The boxes contained expired solvent containers that ruptured during heat exposure. Crews confirmed the ash smell came from plastic and wood that settled unevenly under asphalt after the rushed renovation. They transported the debris to a proper disposal site and filled the cavity with stable soil. After workers repaired the pavement, Ryland walked the lot at dusk and listened for any sign of hidden noise. The tapping had stopped, and the ground felt firm under every step. He wrote a final note describing the discovery and placed it with other logs so future staff could understand the history. People still mention the motel when storms roll across the ridge because the lot glistens strangely after heavy rain. Ryland thinks the glimmer comes from newer asphalt mixing with old gravel, but he also knows that memories of buried things often linger longer than anyone expects. He told Linton the mystery felt smaller once evidence replaced fear, and Linton agreed as they locked the shed and watched distant trucks roll past on the quiet highway. The stories. This lakeside pier hides something no one reports. Lodge crews in the region still talk about an old pier tucked behind a quiet lake that draws almost no visitors. They say the pier looks normal from a distance, yet people keep finding strange evidence near its end that never reaches public reports. In the summer of 2019, a maintenance worker named Ryland Keating drove out to that lake for a simple task. He was 29 and worked routine grounds jobs for a small county crew. That day, he only needed to replace a warped board along the outer section of the pier. He liked the lake because it stayed calm even during busy seasons, and he figured the job would be quick enough to finish before lunch. When he parked near the tree line, he noticed the lot was empty, which felt odd because anglers usually arrived before dawn. The air felt thick, and the water looked darker than usual, yet he kept moving because the repair order had been waiting all week. He set his toolbox near the first post, then started walking along the pier to check for softboards before carrying supplies to the far section. Halfway across, he heard a short knock against the underside of the pier, which he assumed came from drifting debris. He leaned over the edge to look for logs, but saw nothing moving. The sound happened again, just 2 boards ahead, and this time he felt a faint vibration under his boots. He stepped back and tried to decide if the pier was shifting because of wind, but the lake's surface stayed flat without any waves. He reached the final stretch where the railing changed from new planks to older, weathered pieces. A notebook sat against the inner corner near the last post, which made him freeze because the crew did not store items out there. The notebook looked soaked along the edges, and several pages had stuck together. He picked it up and flipped through the front until he found a name that he did not recognize. The entry mentioned fishing conditions from early spring and included a rough drawing of the lake that ended with a short line stating the water felt wrong that day. He set the notebook down and crouched to check the damaged board that needed replacing. When he pulled the old plank free, he spotted a small metal badge wedged between the beams. It had no markings other than deep scratch lines that looked deliberate. The badge felt cold and heavy despite the warm morning air. He wiped away dirt, then placed it inside his shirt pocket because he wanted to check county records later. Ryland returned to his truck for the replacement board and felt uneasy during the walk back because the knocking sound continued at irregular intervals. When he reached the trunk, he noticed mud streaks on his rear bumper that did not match his earlier tracks. The streaks started near the center, then curved down toward the gravel, as if someone had leaned against the vehicle. He looked around the empty lot and called out asking if anyone needed help. No answer came back. He carried the new plank to the end of the pier and installed it quickly because he wanted to leave. While tightening the final screw, he heard a voice from the tree line near the far side of the lake. The words were hard to understand, yet the tone sounded urgent. He turned and scanned the shoreline, but saw no movement except for a faint ripple near the reeds. He stood still and waited for another sound, then heard what he thought was the same voice repeating a short phrase. The wind picked up, which carried the sound across the water in a strange pattern that made it difficult to pinpoint the source. He packed his tools and walked back toward the lot. Before reaching the shore, he noticed footprints near the first post that looked fresh. They were smaller than his boots and pressed deeply into the wood, which suggested someone had been standing there minutes earlier. He followed the prints for a short distance until they looped back toward the reeds and stopped abruptly where the boards felt damp. When Ryland returned to the office, he turned in the repair report and mentioned the found notebook and badge. His supervisor asked him to set both items on a side shelf until someone from records could examine them. That afternoon, the supervisor checked archival calls for that area and found references to an unconfirmed missing angler from early spring. The angler had signed in at the visitor kiosk but never signed out. Crews searched the lake for 2 days, then scaled back when no solid evidence surfaced. Later that week, Ryland decided to look deeper into the notebook. He flipped through more pages and discovered entries describing odd pressure changes near the pier on quiet days. One entry detailed a single ripple moving against the wind and stopping precisely under the pier. Another entry described faint tapping at night that sounded mechanical. None of the entries suggested danger, but the tone shifted in the final pages as the writer mentioned seeing a person standing near the reeds who vanished before he could wave. Ryland checked weather logs for the period mentioned in the notebook and noted a rare drop in barometric pressure that occurred without a storm. He also examined an old photo stored in his phone from a visit months earlier. In the photo, the lake looked normal, yet a small shape near the reeds reflected more light than surrounding water. He zoomed in and noticed a faint outline that resembled a shoulder above the surface. He thought it might be a lighting artifact, but decided to keep the image for reference. A week later, he returned to the lake with a coworker named Laramie Downs, who handled safety inspections. Laramie was older with years of field experience and usually dismissed odd reports, yet she agreed to help because she remembered the missing angler case. They arrived early and walked the length of the pier while checking for structural issues. Laramie tapped each beam with a small tool to test for hollow spots. When she reached the section where Ryland had found the badge, she paused because the sound changed. The beam gave a dull response, like something heavy sat under the structure. Ryland lay flat on the boards and lowered his arm to feel beneath the edge. His fingers touched a cold object that felt like metal. He reached further and pulled out a thin plate with holes drilled along one side. It looked like part of an old sonar bracket, but the lake had no recorded installations. Laramie suggested checking old maintenance logs from 2005 because the county once considered adding depth sensors for safety. She also noted the plate looked corroded only on one half, which indicated it had been partially shielded from water for a long time. They carried the plate to the truck and decided to walk the shoreline before leaving. Near the reeds, they found a small indentation in the mud that resembled a knee print next to a flattened patch of grass. The mark faced the lake as if someone had been kneeling to look at something. Laramie pointed out faint parallel lines near the water, which looked like drag marks. She photographed the area, then flagged it for a follow-up survey. Back at the office, Ryland compared the bracket plate with old schematics from a short-lived depth monitoring trial. He found a drawing showing 2 test brackets installed near the pier before the project was canceled. The logs stated the devices were removed after several malfunctions, but the final report accounted for only 1 bracket. The missing bracket had apparently fallen into the lake or been removed without documentation. The scratch lines on the badge matched the spacing of the holes on the plate, which suggested they had been stored or moved together at some point. Ryland checked weather sensors near the lake for unusual readings over the past year. Several early morning reports showed sharp changes in water temperature near the pier despite stable air conditions. He also found a dispatch log from late spring describing a caller who reported seeing a person waving near the reeds before disappearing under the surface. Responders searched but found no footprints and concluded the caller may have seen a bird landing. One night, Ryland returned to the lake alone because he wanted to verify something noted in the notebook. He walked to the end of the pier and stood still, listening for tapping. The lake stayed quiet until a single knock sounded beneath the beams exactly where he had felt vibration weeks earlier. He crouched and waited, then heard a softer knock that echoed against the metal bracket he had removed. He realized the sound pattern resembled the rhythm of small waves hitting a barrier, which made little sense in calm water. He shined a flashlight into the gap where the bracket had been and saw a narrow space that opened into a small cavity under the pier. Something metallic glinted near the back wall. He reached with a long rod and pulled out a rusted hinge attached to a bent bar. The pieces looked like remnants of an improvised tool. He placed the hinge on the deck, then noticed a wet footprint forming near the end post. The shape appeared in seconds, as if someone had stepped there recently. The board around it stayed dry while the footprint darkened. Rylan backed away slowly and pointed the light at the tree line. Nothing moved, and the air stayed silent. He waited for the footprint to fade, but it held shape for several minutes before drying unevenly. He documented the scene with his phone, then left the lake without waiting for more signs. Weeks later, the county closed the pier for extended maintenance and sealed the logs from public access. The missing angler case remained unresolved, yet several notes were added stating unexplained structural anomalies had been found near the outer section. Rylan kept copies of the notebook entries and the photo of the bright shoulder shape. He never returned to the lake, but told coworkers the pier held a mix of forgotten equipment and quiet warnings that did not reach official channels. He believed the clues pointed to someone spending secret time under the structure long before the angler disappeared. He also believed the knocking he heard came from shifting metal against trapped beams rather than anything mystical. Still, the unexplained footprint remained the detail he never understood. Today, the lake sits quiet behind dense trees, and the pier shows new boards that look identical to the old ones. Locals say nothing strange happens there anymore, and officials agree. Ryland thinks the place carries its own quiet trail of missed signs, and he hopes they stay buried where they cause no more stories.